Hi everyone, FIDE Master Dennis Monokroussos here for ChessLecture.com. And what I'd like to do is to start a series where we look at games by world chess champions. And we're going to go from the beginning, from Steinitz through the current day, which at least at this point sees Viswanathan Anand as the world champion. By the time the series is done, it might be that Gelfand is world champion, but we'll see. At any rate, that's quite a ways off, and we're starting with Steinitz now. Now what I would like to do is to probably show a couple of games by each champion. Maybe in some cases it'll be more than that, but at least a couple of games. And what I hope to do in showing these games is to show them in a way that's relevant to us today. So not just to present a couple of nice games by them, but to show games that involve features that we can use, whether it's some kind of opening idea or a strategic idea or, whatever it is. But something that, again, can be live and fresh to us today and not just interesting as a museum piece or a demonstration of their great ability to calculate. So we're going to start off with a game by Steinitz, and this is from his World Championship match against Mikhail Chigorin. I think, the second match, I believe it was, if I'm remembering right, from 1892. And this was a very close match that Steinitz barely eked out at the end. It was his last World Championship victory before losing the title to Lasker in 1894. Anyway, this is early on in the match, and it's Ruy Lopez, and what I think is especially interesting about this game is that the setup that Steinitz uses is rather a closed one, and it's one that I think we can learn something from today. So let's go ahead and get underway here. Steinitz had white against Chigorin, and Chigorin did not play the Chigorin variation or head for it, but played instead the Berlin. And here, rather than castling, I'm not sure how developed the theory was at this point. Obviously, it's not where it is today, but I'm not sure what the debates were between castles and d3 at that moment. But anyway, Steinitz played d3, a closed setup. Chigorin played d6. Steinitz played c3. And this is still an entirely viable setup today. So white is keeping the position in the center undetermined as yet. He might play d4, he might not. So he's keeping the center stable. He's going to develop his pieces and kind of wait and see what black does before determining any course of action. Now, I'm going to take a look, in fact, at two games here. So the Chigorin game will be our main game, but I also want to show you, just in brief, a game that he played against Lasker. And this is from game 2 of their first match. And at the beginning of the match, Steinitz really fought tremendously. I mean, that's the one thing that was great about Steinitz. I mean, he was definitely, I would say, by a pretty clear margin, the weakest of all the world champions. But what makes Steinitz such an important and fascinating figure is how far ahead of his time he was in terms of positional understanding. I mean, prior to Steinitz, it was really still the Morphy era in terms of the attitude towards the game. You had players like Adolf Anderssen and Johannes Zukertort and Blackburn and all of these crazy attacking guys. And Chigorin was also very aggressive, though he was rather sophisticated in his own right, too. But Steinitz, among the many things that he taught was the necessity of a positional foundation. And while Morphy also promoted that in the context of the open games, Steinitz showed that the closed games could be played quite, showed the importance, let's say, of positional factors in the closed games, too. In fact, closed games were more or less almost completely ignored back then. So, he started to show what was capable, what capabilities were inherent in those positions, too. Also demonstrated that a cramped position need not be a bad position. Now, he took it to extremes sometimes, but what he demonstrated in that respect, too, was also enlightening. There are many, many things that he introduced to the game that really moved it along, and used by stronger players like Tarrasch, like Lasker, and so on, really led to a huge development in chess. But anyway, at the beginning of this match with Lasker in 1894, he was really fighting tooth and nail. He played very energetically, and was even through, I think, the first 6 or 8, maybe even 8 games before Lasker really started to pull away. Anyway, this was game 2. Lasker had won the first game, and then Steinitz came back to win this one. So this game went like this. Bishop to d7, bishop a4. The idea, in part, is to avoid tricks with knight to d4 at some point if he plays queen to e2. That's part of it, but also just to be able to preserve this bishop from exchange against knight a5. So he wants to keep it. All right, so after bishop to a4, Lasker played g6, knight b to d2, bishop g7, knight c4, castles, and knight e3. And just as in the game we're going to see with Chigorin, Steinitz makes this knight's tour first. In the game with Chigorin, he brings the knight to f1 first. And that shows a reason to avoid castling straight away, because if the rook's sitting on f1, you have to spend another tempo moving it to e1 and then bring the knight to e3. So this whole idea with d3, making the knight's tour first, and only then deciding how to play from there, whether you go for d4 or something else, was kind of a Steinitz patent, and it's an idea that we can use as well nowadays. So this last game continued with knight to e7, bishop to b3, c6, and now something else we're going to see in the Chigorin game, and that's h4. Very funny looking idea. Well, not that funny. I mean, certainly we've seen the dragon, for example, and the Yugoslav attack against the dragon. So the idea of playing h4, h5, trying to soften black up on the king side against this fianchettoed position is something that's known. Although Chigorin's idea is a bit different. After queen to c7, he played knight to g5. So hitting f7, and he doesn't mind h6. He's simply going to ignore it. Lasker played d5, and here Steinitz played f3. And this is, I would say, part of the classical heritage. So we all know that when you attack on the wing, the opponent most of the time should try to counterattack in the center. So Steinitz is doing everything he can to keep the center very stable. He's not going to take on d5 without an extraordinarily good reason. So he wants to keep everything really solid in the center, make sure that nothing's happening there, so that he has a free hand, or a relatively free hand, to attack over on the king side. Lasker played rook a to d8, g4. Okay, and here Lasker took on e4. He could certainly consider playing d4 as well. After something like this, let's say takes and takes, knight g2. This queen check is just a blank shot. The king goes to f1, it's fine, and white might even play rook h3 and kick the queen back out. So from here, maybe h6 is best. Let's say knight h3, c5, knight g to f4, and the position is unclear. And white's threatening knight takes g6 in some cases, not right now because the knight's got it defended, but could happen at some point. g5 may also show up. So it's just a very complicated position. All right, instead of d4, though, Lasker played d takes e4, and Steinitz recaptured with the f-pawn. So he's got the g4 pawn sufficiently defended. All right, Lasker played h6, and now a very good move by Steinitz. He played queen to f3. And black really can't take this knight. If he takes, well, first of all, let me mention the threat. So the threat is to take twice on f7. So knight f7, rook f7, bishop f7, oops, king f7, and then g5 takes advantage of this pin here. So black might be tempted to take, but in this case, the attack on the h-file is going to be way too strong. For instance, if knight h7, with the idea of knight takes g5, white plays knight f5, so the bishop protects that pawn. And after this, white is going to regain one piece for starters. And here, this is just too much. So you can see he's got two pawns for the piece already. f6 is looming. Black is losing at this point. All right. So instead of taking the knight, Lasker played, what did he do here? He played bishop to e8. So he's got to overprotect the f7 pawn. And now, okay, he's also threatening the pawn on d3. So Steinitz played bishop c2. Knight to d7, aiming for c5, again to pressure the d3 pawn. So Steinitz retreated, knight c5, knight f2, b5, g5, h5. And here, perhaps Lasker had anticipated a position like this and thought that he would be okay. But there is a second wave of the attack coming, and Steinitz starts it with knight to f5. And now, well, here Lasker probably should have resisted temptation and played something like the bishop back to h8 to avoid the exchange, or maybe played knight to e6. Maybe this is best, but both moves are pretty decent. Instead, he decided to make Steinitz prove that the attack was good enough, and Steinitz did. So the game continued after this with e takes f5, f6, and now g6. And black was forced to give up the piece, takes and takes. Bishop takes g6, rook to g1. And here black's last chance was to play bishop takes d3. And in fact, here he would be okay. So it's a precarious position. White still has an initiative. For instance, the best move here might be bishop to h6. Black absolutely has to play e4, queen h5, rook d5. And it looks like white can just kind of cash in, and it ends up being a slightly better ending for white. Just a tiny bit better, but really should be a draw. So rook takes, queen takes, and then white takes on d5, takes on g7, takes on d3, and it all comes out about equal. Okay, well, instead of this, instead of playing bishop takes d3, Lasker played something else. He played, I believe it was e4. Yeah, e4, d takes e4, king h7. So his idea was this. Okay, if he played the immediate king to h7, then rook takes g6, king g6, d4 is check, and then white can pick up the knight on c5. So I guess Lasker thought that this was a clever way of avoiding that, but he miscalculated, because after rook g6, king g6, queen f5 check, king f7, queen h5 check, and then queen takes c5, white is just up a lot of material and finished very cleanly. You can see the rest of the game in the PGN file. But I wanted to show that this idea of Steinitz could be used in more than just one game. It wasn't just a bit of good luck in this game with Chigorin that this plan turned out to work out all right. He was able to use it against Lasker a couple of years later, and Lasker was certainly familiar with this game that we're going to look at now with Chigorin. All right, so moving on. Instead of bishop to d7, Chigorin played g6. And this is all quite sensible. As I mentioned, knight to f1 this time rather than going to c4. The reason why is that if he goes to c4 here, perhaps Chigorin would have played a6, because bishop to a4 allows b5, and I don't think that Steinitz especially liked making this exchange. So that's the idea of knight f1. We just avoid that problem. Okay, castles, bishop a4, and here black probably should have played either a6 with the idea of b5 and knight a5, expanding like the Chigorin variation, of course, or he could have played the immediate d5. This would be all right too, and after d5, maybe something like queen to e2, and then either knight to d7, hopping over to c5, or knight h5, eyeing the f4 square. In both cases, black should be doing just fine. So I'm not claiming that white gets any advantage with this Steinitz plan, but it's an interesting plan, and it has its drop of poison. Okay, in the game, Chigorin played knight to d7, which is a respectable idea, just this might not be the very best way of executing it. He's got 2 points to it. One is that he would like to put the knight on c5, and secondly, he wants to play f5, kind of like a King's Indian sort of attacking formation. But without the white pawn committed to d5 already, it's a little bit questionable. I mean, it's not that it's bad, but white has more resources. White can sometimes play d4 and not go to d5. And then with the center more in flux, it's not so easy for black to attack. Remember what I said when I was showing the Lasker game, namely that if you're trying to attack on the flank, generally speaking, you want the center to be stable. So that's the problem with black playing f5 here. It isn't stable yet. There isn't a white pawn on d5. Well, after knight to d7, Steinitz continued his knight's tour, going to e3. And black could consider f5 here. If he does, then something like takes, and knight to d5 is playable. I think some sources claim that this was slightly better for white, although I'm not entirely sure. I mean, okay, black plays f4, king h8 if necessary, knight f6, and has possible play on the light squares, on the center, on the g-file, and so on. Well, Chigorin, in fact, did not play f5, and in fact, he never plays f5 in this game. So he played knight c5, bishop c2. Again, if f5, white would trade and play d4, and there I think it's correct that white does have an edge. So knight e6, and now, what do you think Steinitz did? Did he castle kingside? Did he play d4 as a pawn sacrifice? Maybe b4 and then bishop to b2 with the idea of d4? Nope. h4. So the same plan we saw in the Lasker game. Again, f5 would be met by the swap and then d4, although here it's a little bit less clear. So for instance, takes, d4, e4, knight g5, d5. This is a very non-traditional kind of position. I suppose if white can successfully blockade over on the king side, he might have an edge. So some idea like g3 and knight to g2, perhaps prefaced by this exchange. Maybe there is something to this. So I think white does have some pressure here, but I'm not positive that he has it's not clear that he has an advantage. But he probably has at least a little pull. Anyway, black did not play f5, but played knight to e7. So Chigorin's hopping around all over the place with the knights, and Steinitz's play has been much more purposeful. So h5, d5, so there's the central break at last, but it's a little bit slow. So h takes g6, and now after the normal move, h takes back, white's got a few good options. Perhaps the best is knight to g4, eyeing e5, in some cases f6, and certainly h6 with either piece. And I think black has to be rather careful. And even if the queens come off the board, black has some dangers to worry about here. And I think, just looking at this offhand, I suppose if here, I don't know if white can get away with knight h6 check. It looks a bit suspicious, but it might be worth examining to see if you can do it. White might also be able to play this, this as well. So I'm not sure that black is all that happy here, but probably that's a little bit safer than f takes g6. Well, now all of a sudden, Steinitz switches directions completely. So he's been playing this kind of slow approach, keeping the center closed, trying to build up on the king side. Well, now Steinitz changes direction very rapidly and stops on a dime. And this, I think, is one of the, this is always an impressive feature of a great player. Something that I've noticed many times over the years, but it always strikes me afresh each time. Generally speaking, when you're talking about club players, even masters, ordinary masters, when we've got a plan in our mind, when you and I have plans in our minds, generally we're pretty dogged about them. We stick to them fairly solidly, all right, at least most of the time. But top players, I think, have a special ability, more so than most of us, to, again, when they see that something important has changed, to immediately abandon their plan and take advantage of the changed circumstance. So watch what Steinitz does now. So from keeping the center closed and fixed and building to the king side, building on the king side, now he just completely changes. So he takes on d5 and plays bishop to b3. So now it's about this diagonal. He's willing to open the center, even though his king is uncastled and most of his pieces are still at home. And watch how rapidly black's position falls apart. So Chigorin played queen to c6. Steinitz plays queen to e2. So he's threatening the pawn on e4. Maybe more importantly, he's preventing black from playing e4, which would open the board a bit. And now what does black do? There's not really any convenient way to protect this pawn on e5. If you were to play something like queen to c5, well, first of all, he would get hit hard by d4 when he can't take, because then not only the bishop, but the queen would hit the knight on e6. So that's really not very good at all. But what else could he do if he wants to protect it? I mean, he can go to b5, but, well, all right, here I think the simplest move would be knight to g5, hitting this second time and hitting the pawn on h7. So black already has some serious tactical problems in the position. So he just decided, forget the e-pawn, he's willing to open the board up. And it's an interesting idea. In fact, white might be able to play knight takes e5, but it gets very, very complicated. It's very messy. And, you know, now it's black's king that's safe, and, you know, white's king is a little bit funny. Probably white is still a little bit better after the complications in some position like this. King h8, bishop e6, queen h2, knight f8, rook f8. I mean, white's a full piece up at this point, but his king's position is, as I said, a little bit bad. Rook takes f2 is threatened, so black is quite all right. So it's entirely proper for Steinitz to avoid this temptation. That pawn on e5 is going to be weak forever, and taking it just completely gives up the initiative. So instead, he plays, well, much more sanely, I would say. So he keeps control over the position. So bishop to e3, preparing to castle queenside, king h8, castles. And now all of a sudden, you know, white has finished his development, and he's not even behind in development, despite all those knight bouncing around moves and the bishop going to and fro. He's got both rooks into the game. Black doesn't have both of his rooks going yet. All right, well, now black puts his second rook into the game. And here white plays a very nice move. This is really, I think, the star move of the game. It's not flashy, but it's what makes all the flashy things that follow happen. He plays queen to f1. Now, this looks like routine prophylaxis, because when the queen was on e2, I mean, there are these knight jumps that are possible. A knight might come to f4. Maybe even better, it could come to d4 and, you know, take advantage of a couple of pins. Also, if white wants to play d4, obviously that would open up the e-file with potential trouble against the queen. So by playing queen to f1, he sidesteps all of that. Well, in this position, Chigorin played a5. He had to play h5 instead, or knight to f4. So one of these two moves was really required. But he plays a5, and it makes sense. He wants to play a4, chase the white bishop off of its very good diagonal, and, well, just keep pushing the pawn. If you go a4, a3, you can at least create some weaknesses in white's castled position over on the queen side. But he's a bit too late. d4. Now white threatens to play d5. So Chigorin took, Steinitz recaptured. Took with the bishop, because if he takes with the knight, then the problem is that this bishop is alive, and white plays rook takes h7 check. So king h7, queen h1, bishop h6, queen h6, checkmate. So that's a pretty convincing argument against knight takes d4. And that's why Chigorin played bishop takes d4. But now Steinitz makes another very nice move. He plays rook takes d4. Not the bishop. So that bishop will do all kinds of damage. I mean, well, we'll see. We'll see shortly. Here, black needed to play rook to e7. He's positionally lost here. I mean, white's bishops are fantastic. He's got a dangerous attack. But this avoids an immediate catastrophe. Instead, Chigorin played knight takes d4. And even after bishop takes d4, he's in plenty of trouble probably. But, you know, he has to play rook f6. But if white takes, all that is just a big exchange, because white first sacrificed the exchange and would only then be getting it back. But Steinitz had another idea in mind altogether, and this is part of the reason behind queen to f1. Rook takes h7 check. So it works here too. King h7, queen h1 check, and now bishop h6. Actually, queen h6 is just as fast, but they're both fine. Now, if the king comes to the h-file, bishop takes f8 is checkmate. So black brings his king to f6, and now queen to h4. And after king to e5, if he goes to f5, then queen to f4 is checkmate. So he goes to e5, but now, at last, the knight gets recaptured 5 moves later, and black resigned because it's checkmate in one move. After king f5, queen f4, or g4 does the trick. So a very nice game by Steinitz, but again, more important than that, as nice as that is, there's a very interesting plan there. So this idea of playing d3, maneuvering the knight to e3 before castling, and then even playing h4, h5 is quite interesting. So it's key that you keep the center stable. If you're black, you should probably go for a quick d5. I mean, that would be one reasonable plan to execute. But as we saw, both in this game and in the Lasker game, playing d5 doesn't by itself magically solve all of black's problems either. So I think this is a very instructive game. And it's also a kind of plan that you might be able to consider in the Italian game too. The Italian game where white plays c3 and d3. So be aware of this idea. It is playable. It has its drop of poison. It doesn't refute either the Ruy Lopez or the Joko piano, obviously, but it's a nice and relatively untheoretical way to play. So if you don't want to study a lot of theory, you can give this line a try every once in a while and see how it goes. All right, well, that'll do it for this show. I'll present another Steinitz game illustrating a different, very important concept in the next video. So I'll see you then. This is FIDE Master Dennis Monokroussos signing off for ChessLecture.com. Bye-bye.